So what we're going to do today, the three of us, is talk about various aspects of the Australian prison project. All we can do really in a time is present some different fragments of different areas of the project. The project involves probably around 10 people in total, including the researchers that are working on it. So it's a large project with a number of different people looking at different areas. We've got a website if you're interested in looking at some of the aspects of the research, which are up on that website at APP, and Mel's email address there. She's the contact person for the project, and she doesn't mind me contacting. So, a bit of background to what we're doing and why we're interested in developing this project. It really arose from this concern about the continuing growth in the rate of full-time imprisonment. And I put there sort of global / localised and uneven. I mean, what we were interested in doing was looking at these broader tendencies in terms of the growth of imprisonment, specifically in the context of Australia. And I think, although we can recognise common patterns across jurisdictions, the developments and changes in the growth of imprisonment are in fact quite uneven. They're uneven globally, and they're uneven within particular states. Certainly, if you think of countries that surround Australia, parts of Asia and the Pacific, growth of imprisonment has not been such an issue. And indeed, imprisonment rates can be quite low in many countries simply because issues that we define as being criminal justice are dealt with outside of the state. So there is this unevenness globally, and there is also an unevenness within states, and particularly in Australia as a federal system, the growth hasn't been uniform, and certainly imprisonment rates are not uniform within Australia. And it's something that we find when we look at other places like the US and so forth. We were concerned about particular increases in terms of imprisonment, increases in remand or pre-trial detention, which has been a major concern in Australia, and from what I hear from people also here in Ireland. Increases in imprisonment of women, Indigenous people in Australia, and we'll come back and talk a bit more about those, both women and Indigenous people, as well as the third group, people with mental health disorders. And we're also concerned about how we explain this material expansion, what we call the material expansion of the penal estate. More prisons being built, expanded use of preventive detention, developments of detention in the community, that the walls of the prison are certainly no longer a physical wall, and prisoners move very much into the community with various forms of control. And also at the time when we started this project, the Northern Territory, a very small jurisdiction in terms of population, but very large in terms of size in Australia, announced a new 1,000-bed prison, and in itself perhaps not unusual, but in the context of the Northern Territory, that's the largest capital infrastructure project that's ever been undertaken in the Northern Territory by the Northern Territory government. So it gives you an idea of the developments that are occurring. So Australian prison population growth, we're looking at the moment, the last prison census, just under 30,000 full-time prisoners in Australia. Flow-through numbers in terms of people coming in and out of prison over a 12-month period, probably double, if not more, that figure. But the census data shows on that particular day just under 30,000 full-time prisoners. And this graph here is increases in rates, not numbers. I just make that point because if it was the numbers, you'd see the numbers doubling around every decade. What we see there, though, in terms of growth rates from the early 1980s through to 2007 is a doubling in the rate of imprisonment. The top line is the total, that line is sentence, and the bottom line is remand. So a doubling in the rate of imprisonment across Australia during that period of time, a 20-year period of time. But as I said, if it was the numbers that we were putting up there, you would see it doubling around every 10 years, which is a phenomenon that's not particular to Australia. So the Australian Prison Project is made up of the following people: Eileen, who's here, Eileen Baldry, David Brown, who is perhaps known to many of you as a long-term activist and academic around prison issues, both in Australia and internationally. Mark Brown, who's written quite a lot around risk, myself. Maggie Hall and Diana Johns are our two PhD students that are working on this project. Both are more mature age students. Maggie has had a long career as a lawyer in the Legal Aid Commission representing prisoners and has retired from that, is now writing a PhD. Melanie Schwartz and Alex Steele are the other two academics involved in the project. And across a number of universities and states in Australia. So within the project, what we're doing is what we refer to as nested studies. That is, we're looking at research into different areas and attempting to bring that together. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we're going to try and bring it together in a moment. But the various areas that we're looking at is firstly vulnerable populations and specifically our Indigenous people, women, and people with mental health disorders and intellectual disabilities. We're looking specifically at risk, risk around classification, risk in sentencing, risk in preventive detention. I've put in brackets there sex offenders. I think by and large we're looking at sex offenders as a category of prisoner that really encapsulates probably most clearly the development of risk across those various areas in terms of classification, sentencing and preventive detention. We're looking at sentencing, remand, parole, the legislative, the administrative and procedural changes in terms of how they're driving the prison population. Sentencing in terms of increases in maximum sentences, remand particularly around the removal of the presumption in favour of bail, I think is probably easier to put it, that increasingly people are not entitled to bail for an ever-increasing number of offences and categories of offenders, and parole, the fact that it's increasingly more difficult to get parole, a point that again I've heard here over the last couple of days. Terrorism, perhaps a discussion that I haven't heard so much over the last couple of days in the context of the contemporary impact of terrorism on prison systems, and that's one thing that's of particular importance in a number of jurisdictions in Australia. The way the impact of the war of terror is reconfiguring the way prison systems work, particularly around issues of security, and that impacts far more broadly than those few prisoners who may be in prison for terrorist-related offences. I think perhaps in Australia we've got maybe 24 prisoners that are serving time in New South Wales and Victoria in relation to terrorist offences, but the impact has been much broader than that across the prison system. Prison and popular culture. Mel's going to talk a little bit more about that today. I mean, one important part of the project is looking at the popular culture around the prison and the role of the prison more generally within the media. And the final area, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about today, are the multiple costs of imprisonment. How do we envisage these broader issues around costs, social costs, financial costs, opportunity costs. And the two PhDs that we've got, sentencing and prisoner experiences and post-release theory, practice and lived experience. Both of those parts of this project are very much centred around talking with prisoners. Maggie's PhD on sentencing and prisoner experiences is contrasting, and it's very much reflects her work as a lawyer representing prisoners over a long period of time, contrasting sentencing comments made by judges and magistrates at the point of sentencing and prisoners' experiences. So what's the relationship between what judicial officers expect to happen to someone when they incarcerate them and their actual experiences in the prison system? Diana's looking at post-release theory, practice and lived experience again, interviewing people after their release from prison and their experience of post-release. So that's sort of a broad picture of what we're doing in this project, and as I say, today we're just going to pick out some fragments really of this to talk about in detail. The linchpin that we're using to try and bring all this together, to make it something more than just the bits and pieces, but to bring it together into some sort of conceptual framework, is around the idea of penal culture. And we've got a fairly long, in fact a very long definition, given it's all one sentence there, of what we understand to be penal culture around the socially constructed elements, the values, the beliefs, expectations, sensibilities and purposes legislation, policy and procedures that come together, that are woven together into creating a penal realm within the specific context of Australia. Or, in short, the short definition, how the prison becomes culturally embedded within particular settings. So that's really the broader framework that we're trying to use to bring all of this together, to understand the changes, the developments in prison in the specific context of Australia over the last 20 decades. So, just a bit of information, background information really on imprisonment. Australia is neither the best or the worst if you're talking about imprisonment rates, the rate at which we incarcerate people. The imprisonment rate in Australia in 2008-2009 was 165 per 100,000 adult population. And you can see the increases in all jurisdictions except for Queensland over that 5-year period leading up to the most recent national figures. So 165.6 per 100,000, as I said, there's certainly plenty of jurisdictions that are far more excessive in their use of imprisonment than Australia, and there are also many jurisdictions that use imprisonment to a lesser degree. Now, you'll see with this though that there are significant variations. And I picked the two worst case examples there, Northern Territory and Western Australia. Imprisonment rate in Northern Territory is 646. That's the general imprisonment rate. And in WA, 238 per 100,000. So very significant differences within jurisdictions, and gives more substance to this idea in terms of the unevenness of imprisonment within the overall state within Australia. And of course, what drives that in terms of WA and the Northern Territory in particular is the racialisation and colonial dimension of the criminal justice system. They are the states where there are significant proportions of Indigenous people living in those territories. So if we begin to look specifically at groups within the prison system, we get a very different view now of the levels of incarceration. So Western Australia, the rate of Indigenous imprisonment, specifically in Western Australia, is just under 4,000 per 100,000. So it's around 3,600, 3,700 per 100,000. Also quite high in New South Wales, South Australia, the states with, generally the states with significant Indigenous populations, but not exclusively. So a very different picture anyway when you begin to look at the racialisation, the profound racialisation of punishment within the country, and really not just racialisation, but the ongoing colonial dimension of the criminal justice system within Australia. And Harry Wedge can put it in a much more succinct way than I can. He's an Aboriginal artist who learned to paint in prison, and the title of that painting is British Justice. And certainly Indigenous people and their organisations in Australia interpret those high levels of imprisonment within a context of colonisation and ongoing colonisation. That's the area that I work mostly in, but it's not what I'm going to talk about primarily today.